In the early 1860s, during the American Civil War, one of the most notorious serial killers in American history was operating in southern Missouri. Racking up over 40 kills, including women and children, it would take two opposing forces coming together to plot the assassination of Alf Bolin. Issam Day and his son Thomas were exhausted. They had been walking for miles. Issam was 50 years old and his son was 11. Issam's hands were bound and tied to a wagon full of corn drawn by oxen. Their captor was a gang of bushwhackers, as they were called, led by a man named Alf Bolin. Issam knew who Bolin was. Everyone knew who Bolin was. Issam also knew what was going to happen to him. As a preacher, he prayed that nothing would happen to his son. Bolin and his gang walked Issam and Thomas down to the White River, where they eventually let Thomas go. Thomas ran home and told his mother what had happened. Down at the White River, Issam was chained up inside an outhouse for 3 days. It was torture for his crimes, according to Bolin. His crime was aligning with the North. Issam was a Northern sympathizer. Bolin was a Confederate sympathizer, wanting to establish the Confederate nation separate from the Northern Union. This was in the early 1860s and America was in a civil war, and though neither of these men were soldiers, they supported opposite sides. This made Issam his enemy, though Bolin didn't need anyone to be his enemy to commit murder. That was part of his life. After 3 days of torturing Issam, Bolin walked him down to the river, shot him in the back, and weighted his body down with rocks. Bolin took out a knife and cut another notch in the handle, along with the 30 or so that were already there. Issam's body was found 3 weeks later by people searching the waters for a drowned slave, but Bolin and his gang were long gone, in hiding in the mountains. However, as he was hiding out in the Ozark Mountains, a plot had already been set in motion to assassinate Alf Bolin. According to most reports, Alf Bolin was born Alfred Bolin to Matilda Bolin in the winter of 1842. His father is unknown and his mother didn't want him. At the ripe old age of 11, his mother ran off with a horse trader, leaving Alfred to fend for himself in a tiny little one-room shack. Not far down the river was the Cloud family. Though they had 11 children of their own, they took in the little boy who called himself Alf Bolin. The father, Calvin, taught Alf how to hunt and survive in the Ozark Mountains until, as a teenager, Alfie, as he was known then, went out on his own. He immediately fell in with a gang of thieves led by Sam Hildebrand. It is also reported that he later rode with Quantrill's raiders to murder men, women, and children in Lawrence, Kansas, alongside Jesse and Frank James. Having learned from these outlaws, he soon returned to southeastern Missouri to take advantage of the region during the war. At the time, most men were fighting in the war, so the region was women, elderly men, and children. With no law enforcement and a country in chaos, he could take advantage of the people in the region without much resistance. He spent the next 2 years robbing travelers, building a gang, and gaining a reputation. By 1862, the Union Army had heard of him and was on his trail. After murdering 2 Union soldiers, he and 2 of his gang members were running from Union pursuers. With only one gun between them, he headed to the only place where he knew he could get a gun, the Cloud family farm. Bolin and the 2 gang members covered their heads in hoods and rode up to the farmhouse where he grew up. Calvin, who had been fighting for the North, confronted the 3 hooded figures on horseback. All the men asked for was a gun and some ammunition. Calvin said that he didn't have a gun. "Calvin, you're lying," Bolin said. "You got a gun and I want it." Calvin Cloud, the man that raised Alf Bolin, immediately recognized the voice. In return, Calvin stated, "Alf, you know you can have anything I got, but get off the horse, take off that hood, and ask for it like a man." Alf pulled the gun that he had and shot the only father figure that he had ever had. Calvin dropped to the ground dead. Mary Jane, Calvin's wife, ran from the cabin and Bolin shot at her, but missed. They then went down the line of neighboring houses, invading each one, stealing everything they could. Most of the people had heard that Alf Bolin was back and fled, but some hadn't. A few farms down from the Cloud farm was James McGinnis. Bolin simply rode up to the McGinnis house, shot McGinnis in the head, and robbed his house. After this, Bolin knew he needed to leave Stone County and headed to Forsyth in Taney County, where he had spent some time hiding out in the mountains in a region that would later be known as Murder Rocks. While Alf Bolin was conducting his reign of terror across southern Missouri and northern Arkansas, a southern soldier named Robert Foster was rotting in a Union prison in Springfield. He was on death row for his crimes as a Confederate soldier. Robert Foster's home was in Taney County, right in the middle of Alf Bolin's territory, and now there was a bounty out for Bolin. The varied reports state that the bounty was anywhere between $1,000 and $4,000, dead or alive. Bolin would occasionally show up at the Foster house for some supplies, and Miss Foster would cook him dinner basically to appease him so Bolin wouldn't steal from her, or worse. As Robert Foster was a captured Confederate soldier, Alf Bolin thought that this was a safe location as they were like-minded. Furthermore, because Robert was captured, there was no man there, so there wasn't really any threat. Many of the Union soldiers wanted to go after Bolin to cash in on the bounty, so Robert Foster's wife saw an opportunity. So Miss Foster went to the Union soldiers in Springfield and offered a trade. She could get Bolin to her house and get him to let down his guard, and they could keep the bounty. And in return, they would drop all charges against her husband and set him free. The Union soldiers accepted the terms and began plotting the assassination of Alf Bolin. While Miss Foster and the Union troops were putting their plan together, Bolin was wreaking havoc in Taney County. In Day, Missouri, Dave Titsworth, a 16-year-old boy, was taking letters to the post office. The letters were from his family, meant for his sick father, who was fighting in the war. Bolin walked up to Dave, pulled out his pistol, and shot the boy in the chest. Several women nearby ran to help the boy. Bolin told them to get in their house before he scalps them and commented that Dave was number 19 and put another notch on his pistol. Luckily, unlike many others, Dave survived this attack. In another incident along the White River, Bolin came across an 80-year-old man with a wagon and some corn. The man was taking the corn back to his neighbors as food was hard to come by at the time. Bolin told the man to drop the wagon and head back across the river. Once in the middle of the river, Bolin and his gang opened fire. The man's dead body was swept away by the currents. Zachariah Thomas was a native Missourian who had shown bravery and coolness in battle for the Union Army. For these reasons, he was selected by soldiers in Springfield to be the man to assassinate Alf Bolin. Thomas traveled through Missouri posing as a sick Confederate soldier that had escaped a Union camp and made his way to Mrs. Foster's house. She took him in and they waited. On February 1st, 1863, Bolin showed up at Miss Foster's house. She invited him in and began making dinner for him. Upon entering the house, Bolin immediately noticed a steel plow coulter resting next to the fireplace. A coulter is a knife that sits ahead of the plow, cutting a line through dirt and vegetation ahead of the plow. Mrs. Foster told Bolin that the coulter was going to be melted down and made into horseshoes, but she hadn't gotten to it yet, so she was using it as a fire poker. Satisfied with her answer, Bolin sat down at the table while Mrs. Foster prepared a fire in the fireplace. All of a sudden, there was a loud bang on the ceiling above. Bolin drew his pistol with 42 notches cut into the handle and said, "Who's up there?" Miss Foster explained that it was just a sick Confederate soldier who had escaped capture and was heading home. Bolin yelled for the man to come downstairs. Thomas slowly descended the stairs, appearing weak, sick, and frail, posing no threat to Bolin, who still had his pistol drawn. While Bolin looked over Thomas, assessing his risk, Mrs. Foster moved the table near the fireplace and pulled up a chair between the fire and the table. Bolin noticed. "He's sick and needs to keep warm," Mrs. Foster told Bolin. Thomas sat next to the fire and Bolin sat away from it. As they spoke about the war and the politics of slavery, Bolin became comfortable with Thomas and set his pistol down on the table. Thomas knew that Bolin's men were most likely outside the farmhouse. If he snatched Bolin's pistol and fired it, the rest of the gang would come, and he and Miss Foster would be dead, so the pistol wasn't an option. But at least now Bolin was unarmed, so they were on level playing field. When the meal was finished, Bolin stood up and walked around to the fire. He knelt down and scooped a hot red ember from the fire to light the tobacco in his pipe. As he turned his back, Thomas grabbed the coulter and sliced Bolin's back. Bolin fell to the ground where Thomas struck again, this time to the back of Bolin's head, and Bolin fell limp. Thomas and Miss Foster dragged Bolin's body to a back room where he began to moan loudly and tried to get up. Thomas, using the coulter, struck Bolin over and over until he was dead. In order to retrieve the reward money, he had to show that the dead man was Bolin, so Thomas kept the dead man's face intact. Thomas then snuck out into the darkness, maneuvering past Bolin's men, and traveled to a Union camp where several men accompanied him back and retrieved the body and Mrs. Foster. By morning, they had the body loaded up on a cart and were headed to Ozark to collect their reward. They stopped at every house along the way, showing off Bolin's body and announcing that Alf Bolin was finally dead. The news spread quickly and people were playing music and dancing in the streets. By the time they reached Forsyth, the body was decomposing and beginning to smell. All they needed as proof of death was the head, so the soldier, Colbert Hayes, pulled his double-sided axe and removed the head. Alfred Bolin's body was buried next to Swan Creek Road. The head was transported to Ozark. While the Union soldiers collected their bounty, the head was placed on the end of a pole and displayed in the town square by the locals. The town erupted in celebration as women spat on the head and children threw rocks at it. The town of Forsyth, Missouri, started an Alf Bolin Day in 1982 as a celebration to his death that continues today. This is True Tragedies. Please like, leave comments, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.